This last year, we've seen nothing but flops coming out of DC, and it looks like their upcoming Aquaman movie isn't going to fare much better. And a lot of this has been laid at the feet of James Gunn, but I am going to defend him a little bit because most of these, actually all of these movies for that matter, were in the pipeline when he was brought on. The only criticism I have for James Gunn is just the simple fact that he said that these movies are going to basically be retconned out of existence following their release, which doesn't help with the whole shared universe aspect of it when you say that, yeah, everything up to this point is not going to be canon, because then audience members have no incentive to go invest time to watch these movies if they know it's ultimately not going to matter. But I think James Gunn does have ideas about how to improve the whole DCEU. The question is whether that's actually the problem that he's identified and if him coming in is the solution for it. We got this article from Comic Book Resources that kind of talks about it. So James Gunn says DCU needs a wider range of tones, but this was never the problem, and that's according to the headline. And part of this has to do with James Gunn saying that issues with the early phases of DC movies were just they had more of a darker and grittier tone, which was what kind of identified the Snyderverse and what separated them from Marvel movies. But that really wasn't the case as far as tone goes, because I mean, yeah, some of the movies like especially the ones that Zack Snyder directed were kind of like that. But at the same time, when you look at movies by other directors like Wonder Woman, that was Patty Jenkins, or you got the first Shazam movie or Aquaman movie by James Wan and David Sandberg, those movies had their own unique tone and feel to it. I mean, they didn't feel like they're all the same movie, but at the same time, they felt like they're part of the shared universe. And I think that's ultimately what's needed. And I think James Gunn's criticism for having too much of a similar tone stems from his experience with Marvel, because this is what he has to say about that. If there's one prevailing issue with Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's that movies are far too comedic. This removes stakes from the movies, events, and turns the unfair into a giant joke. Thus, it's hard to maintain interest in a franchise that doesn't take itself seriously. Conversely, because so many of the movies follow this formula, it has the effect of making them feel far too similar. That's even the case with characters who are rarely, if ever, lighthearted, with Thor: Love and Thunder turning the epic Norse god into something of a buffoon. And I think he's 100% right when it comes to Marvel, that, yeah, a lot of their movies in the later stages have felt all the same. And ironically, I think James Gunn is the catalyst for that. And let me explain, because in the first phase of Marvel movies, you have directors and writers brought in by the studio to work on a movie and to give their own flair to it, sort of thing. And that's why the first Iron Man movie feels like a different movie than the first Captain America or the first Thor movie. But once James Gunn took over, or once he came in with Guardians of the Galaxy, he was hired on to do what the previous directors did, in that, okay, here's your movie, now do with it what you will, and kind of lend your own voice to it. And he did that with Guardians of the Galaxy, and it was widely popular. And since then, you've seen kind of a transition where all the movies have been kind of going for that feel, where they're making them a bit more comedic, having needle drop soundtracks and things like that. And I'm not necessarily faulting James Gunn for that, because like I said, he was basically just brought on to do a job. He did that job really well. And ever since then, the studio's like, let's make everything like that. And that's why every movie from Marvel kind of since then has almost felt the same, because it was less the studio bringing on directors to lend their own flair to something, and more the studio was basically making the movie. And every once in a while, they might get a director who has like some perspective, but I mean, that's kind of buried beneath Marvelisms, if you will. The problem with what James Gunn's saying about this, though, because I do agree that's the issue with Marvel, I don't think that's the issue with DC. And it does point that out in this article, that movies in DC kind of had their own feel to them. Like you saw that with Aquaman and Wonder Woman and Shazam. I mean, so the whole kind of like same tone and feel doesn't really work with DC. What's the problem with DC movies is they never had any central planning behind it. I mean, it's all referred to as the Snyderverse, and maybe he had some input on where he thinks things should be going. But ultimately, it was the studio kind of making the calls, and that's why everything just felt like there were decisions being made by studios trying to compete with Marvel. But if you bring in James Gunn and let him actually take over, then I think things could work out for DC, especially if they're doing what he says. We're like, okay, make sure movies have their own tone to them. Directors can actually have creative say, and I'm just going to be there. This is James Gunn, just going to kind of be there managing it and just kind of guiding them like, okay, you need to start here and end here because we're setting up for this. All right, got it. That's fine. Every movie other than that, though, is its own thing. But it doesn't look like that's what's going to happen with Warner Brothers, because we're getting this information coming out now, too. Warner Brothers preventing James Gunn from having total control of new DCU. A new report indicates DC Studios co-CEO James Gunn does not have total control over the DCU. Gunn is currently in the midst of preparing a reinvented vision of Warner Brothers' superpowered brand, with names like Superman Legacy, Creature Commanders, and Waller set to kick off things in the franchise in the coming years. But if you scroll down to the article, it does say this. Despite what fans may have thought, it looks as though James Gunn and Peter Safran do not have the full power of the new DCU as some had assumed. According to reporting from Variety, things remain unclear on how much control Gunn and Safran have over the superpowered franchise, especially when it comes to streaming content on the Warner Brothers' own Max streaming service. Unlike their Marvel counterpart, Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige, WB, and Max remain creatively involved with DC slate. While Feige remains fairly autonomous atop the Marvel Studios brand, Gunn and Safran tenure at DC Studios has reportedly been much more collaborative on the TV front. So, I think this is the kind of the issue, because for Marvel, you have a centralized vision behind it, which is Kevin Feige, but he has too much control and he's basically making every movie feel the same. Whereas on Warner Brothers, you got someone like James Gunn, who I think has the right ideas about what to do with it. I mean, he wants to make different tones. He wants to actually allow people to have more creative freedom. But at the same time, you have the studio kind of jumping in, which is in kind of interfering or whatever, if you will, and not letting him do what he wants to do with this, or at least if these reports are to be believed. So it seems like if you got these two studios together or whatever, I mean, that's kind of like perfect what you should be doing. But it seems like we're going to, I mean, even with James Gunn and even with what I think some of his good ideas are, I don't think that the studio, or at least if these reportings are to go by, are going to actually allow him to do this. So I think what we're going to see coming out in the future of DC is really more of what we've seen already, except instead of Zack Snyder getting the blame for not managing it well, we're just going to see James Gunn get the blame for not managing it well. And I'm wondering if in like a few years time frame, if they're going to fire James Gunn for someone else, or if they're going to try to just end up canceling these movies, or maybe it is going to be a success. Who knows? But so far, this isn't really encouraging news coming out of it, or at least if you want these movies to be good. But let me know what you think about this in the comment section below. And if you like this video, make sure you click that like button, share the video, and subscribe to the channel if you want to stay up to date with the latest news. Thank you.